He once chose a donut over a life-changing career opportunity in the same afternoon without much visible hesitation either time, not because he didn't understand what he was giving up, because for Homer Simpson, the version of himself sitting in this exact moment has always mattered more than any version of himself waiting somewhere down the road. Homer Simpson never needed to be smarter. He needed a reason to believe tomorrow was worth planning for at all. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to know exactly which donut joke is coming, and for years I laughed at Homer the same way everyone does, the lovable, lazy oaf who can't resist his own impulses. But you don't just see a man with poor self-control. You see someone who learned early that the future rarely rewarded him for waiting on it, so he stopped investing much hope in it at all. By the end of this video, every impulsive, short-sighted decision Homer Simpson has ever made is going to look a lot less like foolishness, and a lot more like a man protecting himself from a kind of disappointment he's felt before. There's an economic and psychological concept that explains Homer better than simple laziness ever could. Present bias describes a well-documented tendency to overvalue immediate rewards while systematically discounting future consequences, even when someone fully understands intellectually what those consequences will eventually cost them. It isn't about intelligence at all. It's about which timeline actually feels real to a person in the moment of choosing. For Homer, the future has rarely felt reliable enough to sacrifice for, so the donut in front of him keeps winning every single time against a tomorrow he's never quite learned to trust. Homer's father, Abraham, is distant, self-absorbed, and only sporadically present throughout Homer's childhood and adult life, currently residing in a retirement home he frequently feels abandoned in. A resentment Homer largely fails to resolve even into middle age. Their relationship is defined less by open conflict than by a kind of mutual, low-grade disappointment neither man quite knows how to address directly. Growing up with a father, this emotionally unavailable teaches a child something specific about long-term investment, that patience and effort directed toward a relationship don't reliably produce the connection you're hoping for. If sustained effort with your own father rarely pays off, it's a short step toward generally discounting the value of long-term effort elsewhere too, favoring whatever reward is actually available and immediate instead. That early lesson about unreliable long-term payoff followed Homer directly into the family he built himself, starting with the woman who left before he'd even had the chance to understand what leaving actually meant. Homer's mother, Mona, left the family when Homer was a young boy, becoming a fugitive activist and remaining absent for decades before a brief reunion later in his adult life. Her departure, delivered without much explanation a child could actually process, leaves Homer with an early, formative experience of someone he loved simply disappearing from his future entirely. That abandonment reinforces the same lesson his father's distance already suggested, that the people and plans you invest hope in can vanish without warning, regardless of how much you needed them to stay. If the future is something that can simply be taken away without consultation, investing heavily in it starts to feel less like wisdom and more like exposing yourself to unnecessary disappointment. That accumulated uncertainty about whether tomorrow can actually be trusted becomes the emotional backdrop for every impulsive decision Homer makes as an adult, starting with the one relationship that has, against all odds, actually stayed. Marge represents the one genuinely stable, long-term commitment in Homer's adult life, patient through decades of his impulsivity, disappointments, and repeated failures to plan ahead. Their marriage endures largely because Marge consistently absorbs the consequences of Homer's short-term thinking, managing the household's actual long-term stability so thoroughly that Homer rarely has to confront the full cost of his own present bias directly. That dynamic isn't simply comic relief. It reveals something important. Homer's impulsiveness survives, relationship after relationship, mistake after mistake, specifically because Marge's steady, forward-thinking presence keeps absorbing the damage he'd otherwise have to reckon with fully himself. Her reliability, ironically, may reduce his own incentive to develop it, since the future keeps getting managed regardless of what he does today. That safety net, however loving, shapes how Homer parents too, particularly the son who inherited more of his impulsiveness than either of them probably wants to admit. Homer's relationship with his son Bart is defined by frequent conflict, exasperation, and a level of mutual understanding that occasionally surprises both of them, given how similarly impulsive and present-focused they each tend to be. Homer rarely models long-term thinking for Bart, in part because he genuinely struggles to access it himself, leaving father and son locked in remarkably similar patterns, despite Homer's occasional attempts to correct behavior he recognizes, uncomfortably, in himself. That recognition matters. When Homer disciplines Bart for impulsive decisions, he's often confronting, however unconsciously, the same tendency that governs his own life. It's considerably harder to teach patience and long-term thinking you've never fully developed yourself. And Homer's frustration with Bart sometimes reads less like parental disappointment and more like frustration with a mirror he can't quite look away from. That same difficulty, teaching what you've never learned, appears again with his daughter, though her different temperament reveals it in a distinctly different light. Homer's relationship with his daughter Lisa is complicated by her intelligence, ambition, and genuinely long-term thinking, traits that occasionally leave Homer feeling inadequate or disconnected from a child whose entire worldview runs counter to his own present-focused instincts. Despite this gap, Homer demonstrates real, if inconsistent, effort to support Lisa's ambitions, occasionally rising to moments of genuine sacrifice on her behalf. That inconsistency is telling. Homer's capacity for long-term thinking isn't entirely absent. It's selectively accessible, most reliably activated when Lisa's needs become vivid and immediate enough to override his usual present bias. It suggests his impulsiveness isn't a fixed incapacity so much as a default setting that can, occasionally, be interrupted by sufficiently strong emotional stakes. That occasional capacity for genuine long-term sacrifice becomes especially visible and especially costly in his professional life at the plant. Homer's job at the Springfield nuclear power plant, working under the wealthy, exploitative Mr. Burns, offers a specific illustration of his present bias playing out professionally. Homer rarely advocates for his own long-term career interests, frequently accepting poor treatment, minimal advancement, and genuine safety risks in exchange for simply keeping the job that provides for today's immediate needs. That professional passivity mirrors his personal impulsiveness closely. Just as Homer prioritizes the donut over the diet, he prioritizes today's paycheck over any sustained effort toward better long-term employment, in part because the effort required for genuine career advancement has never felt reliably rewarded, given his history with unreliable outcomes elsewhere in his life. That resignation to whatever immediate stability is available, rather than pursuing something genuinely better, connects directly to a broader economic reality shaping an entire generation of workers like him. Homer's frequent retreats to Moe's Tavern and his friendship with fellow regular Barney Gumble represent one of his most consistent coping mechanisms. Immediate relief from stress through alcohol and casual companionship, rather than addressing underlying problems more directly. The bar offers exactly what present bias craves: instant comfort, minimal long-term cost consideration, and a social space that rarely asks anything of him beyond showing up. Barney's own alcoholism, played largely for comedy, mirrors Homer's pattern in an even more exaggerated form, offering Homer a peer whose choices make his own moderate excesses look considerably more manageable by comparison. Their friendship isn't built on ambition or growth. It's built on shared, comfortable avoidance, two men finding company in choosing today's relief over tomorrow's improvement. That pattern of seeking immediate comfort over long-term investment reflects something considerably larger than Homer's individual character, rooted in the specific economic world Springfield represents. To understand Homer fully, it helps to understand the broader economic reality facing American blue-collar workers during the era the show reflects. Deindustrialization and economic stagnation left many working-class families with genuinely limited pathways toward long-term financial improvement, jobs offering modest security but little realistic hope of significant advancement, regardless of effort invested. In that economic context, prioritizing immediate comfort over long-term planning isn't necessarily irrational. It can be a reasonable adaptation to genuinely limited opportunity when the systems meant to reward patience and sacrifice don't reliably deliver on that promise for people in Homer's economic position. His present bias isn't purely a personal failing. It reflects, in exaggerated comedic form, a broader economic reality that gave an entire generation of workers, like him, legitimate reasons to discount a future that often failed to reward the sacrifices made for it. There's a second layer of context worth examining. American consumer culture during the 1980s and 1990s increasingly emphasized immediate gratification, easy credit, fast food, television entertainment designed for instant engagement rather than delayed reward, cultivating an entire cultural environment that reinforced present-focused decision-making as the norm rather than the exception. Homer didn't invent his preference for donuts over diets or beer over budgeting. He absorbed a broader cultural moment that actively marketed instant gratification as both accessible and desirable, with relatively little cultural counterweight emphasizing delayed reward or long-term planning for someone in his specific economic position. That culture didn't create Homer's present bias, but it gave it constant, comfortable reinforcement, making his particular relationship with the future feel entirely unremarkable rather than something worth examining. Homer's neighbor, Ned Flanders, represents almost everything Homer isn't: disciplined, forward-thinking, financially responsible, and consistently oriented toward long-term consequences rather than immediate impulse. Homer's frequent resentment and mockery of Ned function as a kind of defense against a comparison he rarely wins. That resentment isn't really about disliking Ned personally. It's discomfort with a living example of what sustained long-term thinking actually produces: stability, respect, genuine security, precisely the outcomes Homer's own present-focused choices have rarely delivered for him. Ned's presence next door offers Homer a constant, if unwelcome, reminder of the road not taken, one he mostly manages by treating Ned's virtues as a punchline rather than a genuine model worth learning from. Marge's sisters, Patty and Selma, maintain an openly critical, often hostile relationship with Homer throughout the series, viewing him as a permanent disappointment who never lived up to what their sister deserved. Homer's antagonistic relationship with them functions largely as comic relief, but it also reflects a broader pattern. People in Homer's life who represent judgment about his long-term choices tend to become targets of avoidance or ridicule rather than genuine self-examination. Rather than engaging with their criticism as potentially useful feedback, Homer treats Patty and Selma's disapproval as simply another obstacle to tolerate, further evidence that the people demanding long-term accountability from him rarely offer anything Homer experiences as worth the discomfort of actually changing for. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Marge, the one everyone frames as the patient, long-suffering wife simply managing Homer's impulsiveness out of quiet devotion, she's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, someone who needs Homer's present-focused spontaneity just as much as he needs her steady, future-oriented planning. Think about it. Marge grew up with her own considerable anxieties, perfectionism, and a mother whose approval always felt just out of reach. Homer's uncomplicated, immediate enjoyment of life, donuts, television, simple pleasures taken without guilt, offers Marge a genuine counterbalance to her own tendency toward worry and over-planning. His presence pulls her, repeatedly, into moments of joy she might otherwise talk herself out of entirely. So the wife everyone assumes was simply enduring. Homer's short-sightedness turns out to have been quietly relying on his ability to actually live in the present, a skill she never fully developed herself, and one that keeps their marriage from tipping entirely into the anxious over-control she inherited from her own family. What Homer deserved, back before a mother disappeared and a father drifted permanently out of reach, was proof that investing in tomorrow would actually be rewarded eventually. Not a donut chosen over a genuine opportunity. Not another night at Moe's instead of another attempt at the future he'd stopped fully trusting. What he actually received was an early, thorough lesson that the people and plans he hoped for could simply vanish, so he stopped hoping quite so hard and started taking whatever comfort was actually available to him right now instead. He built an entire life around the present moment, So a future that had already disappointed him twice could never quite catch him unprepared again. He built it so well. He rarely let himself notice how much long-term stability it was quietly costing the people who loved him. And in Lisa's rare moments of genuine sacrifice made on her behalf, in Marge's decades of steady partnership, that was the boy still waiting for someone to stay, finally quietly, discovering that some things actually do. The donuts were never about the donuts. They never were. So was Homer Simpson simply lazy, or a man who stopped trusting the future entirely? Neither, honestly. Homer wasn't a naturally foolish man who happened to lack self-control, and he wasn't a deeply wounded man merely performing laziness for laughs. He was someone who turned two early disappearances and an economy that rarely rewarded patience into a permanent preference for whatever comfort was actually available today, because tomorrow had already let him down more than once before he ever got the chance to doubt it on purpose. Maybe that's truer of more of us than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person who can't seem to plan for the future isn't careless about it at all. He's just been burned enough times by hoping for one that he's stopped fully believing it's his to plan for. So here's what I want to know. If Homer's parents had actually stayed, reliably, through his whole childhood, do you think he still becomes a man who chooses the donut every time? Or was that instinct always going to find him somewhere, given everything else stacked against him? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.